Chapter 1. The Arrival. The stars stretched out endlessly before her, an ocean of glimmering lights against the pitch-black canvas of space. For many, the sight would have been a thing of beauty majestic in its incomprehensible vastness. Yet, for the tiny alien girl, who had been tossed into this foreign galaxy, it was a sight that filled her with unease and dread. She had never asked to be here, to be among these strange creatures who populated the stars. Her entire existence had been turned upside down when the invaders came to her peaceful world, not with offers of friendship or diplomacy, but with weapons of unimaginable destruction. Her people had been forced into the chaos of war, and now she found herself stranded on a foreign planet, helpless and lost. The world she had once known seemed a lifetime away, a distant dream now shattered by the horrifying realities of intergalactic conflict. In her small, trembling hands, she clutched the broken communication device she had found amidst the wreckage of her ship. She didn't understand much of its technology. Humans had such strange ways of communicating, but she knew it was the last thread of hope she had left. She had to find someone, anyone, who could help her, who could understand her fear and protect her from the dangers she knew were closing in. Her species, the Ilrakal, were known throughout the galaxy as skilled warriors, but even they could not fight against the overwhelming might of the human empire that had come crashing into her world. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crouched behind the large rocks in the alien wilderness, feeling the heat of the sun on her back. The strange, unrecognizable trees of this planet loomed overhead, their branches twisting like serpents, casting long, eerie shadows. She had no idea where she was or how she had gotten here. All she knew was that this place felt dangerous. Its strange creatures and the hum of unfamiliar technology sent chills down her spine. The only thing she knew for certain was that she could not trust the humans. Their ships had obliterated her home planet, and they had left no survivors except her. At least, that's what she had believed. The last thing she remembered before the crash landing on this world was the explosion of her escape pod, spiraling out of control as it plummeted through space. The human ships had made sure of it. They had left nothing but destruction in their wake, wiping out her world with impunity, without remorse. She had been the last one, the only one to escape. A noise soft, at first, like the flutter of wings, brought her back to reality. She froze, clutching her knees to her chest, her small body trembling with fear. Her breath was shallow, as she listened for any signs of movement. Had they found her? Were the humans finally closing in, tracking her down after all these days of hiding? She had heard them speak of her kind, these humans who seemed to have an insatiable thirst for conquest. She had heard the stories of what they did to those they considered weak. Would she be the next one to fall? The footsteps grew louder, closer now. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to flee, but she couldn't. Her body was weak, and her mind was clouded with confusion and fear. She was cornered. There was no escape. She couldn't outrun a human. She had seen their ships. She had seen their power. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and her heart sank. She was so small, so fragile compared to them. She had heard the stories from the elders on her planet, tales of what happened when they captured someone from her species. The humans had no respect for other creatures, no understanding of their ways. They only cared about their own survival and expansion. But just as the footsteps reached her hiding spot, the world went silent. The air around her thickened, the sound of her own heartbeat the only thing that filled her ears. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. Then, the voice came. "Hey, it's okay." The words were unexpected, soft, calm, and tinged with an accent that she had never heard before. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly dared to peek from behind the rock. The human stood there, not more than a few feet away. He was tall, but not as imposing as she had imagined. His clothing was simple, a rugged survival suit, and he held a strange-looking device in his hands, almost like a rifle. His face was covered in dust, but his eyes, those eyes were soft, kind even. He wasn't looking at her with the cold, calculating gaze she had come to expect from her captors. The human knelt down slowly, as if trying to make himself less intimidating. His hand extended toward her, palm open. She flinched, instinctively pulling back, her mind flooded with memories of the weapons that had decimated her people, the violent onslaught of human power. Could this human really be different from the others? Could he be one of the few exceptions to the cruelty she had witnessed? It's okay, he repeated, his voice gentle, reassuring. I'm not going to hurt you. I know you're scared. Her eyes widened as she searched his face, looking for any sign of deceit. She had no reason to trust him. He was human, her enemies. But there was something about his demeanor, the way he spoke, that made her hesitate. He didn't seem like the others. He didn't seem like a soldier or a conqueror. She felt a spark of curiosity, and it flickered faintly beneath the veil of her fear. Was it possible? Could there really be a human who didn't want to harm her? The weight of his words, the softness in his voice, made her want to believe it just for a moment. But belief was dangerous. She knew that too well. She had seen countless lives lost to the same false hope. So, she took a step back, her small, delicate frame trembling as she tried to push herself further into the shadows. She couldn't trust him. She couldn't afford to. The human saw her movement, his hand still outstretched, but now there was a noticeable hesitation in his posture. He didn't rush forward. He didn't advance in a way that might seem threatening. He stayed back, his expression unreadable but understanding. I'm not going to hurt you, he repeated, his voice a little softer now. I know you've been through a lot, and I don't know what's happened to you, but you're safe now. I'll make sure no one hurts you. Lila's eyes narrowed at the mention of safety. The words sounded foreign to her. It had been so long since she had felt safe. Her home had been destroyed, her people scattered or wiped out entirely, and now she was here, on a strange, hostile world with no one to turn to. Trust was a luxury she no longer had. Yet there was something compelling in the human's words, something that reached deep into her chest, stirring a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to have in what felt like an eternity hope. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to believe him. But was it enough to risk her life? She stayed silent, watching him carefully, her small frame trembling. The human finally sighed, lowering his hand slowly. I know I'm not what you expected. I'm not here to harm you, but you don't have to trust me. If you want, I can just leave, and you can go your own way. I'll give you some food and water, and I'll be gone. But if you want help, I'll give it. Lila was torn. The offer seemed genuine, but she couldn't remember the last time someone had offered her help without expecting something in return. And yet, the calm in his voice, the sincerity in his actions, there was no hidden malice. She had learned over the years to trust her instincts, and something told her that this human was different. After a long pause, her voice broke through the silence, soft and hesitant, barely above a whisper. I can't go back, she whispered, her voice tinged with pain. The Zidarians will come for me. The human nodded, understanding in his eyes. I won't let them, he said simply. Not while I'm here. In that heartbeat, everything changed. The walls Lila had built around her heart, the defenses she had constructed over years of pain and loss, began to crack. She had been alone for so long, desperate for even the smallest ounce of kindness. And maybe, just maybe, this human was offering her exactly that. The wind whipped through the trees as Elias, the human, stood motionless, watching the tiny alien girl with his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen countless things throughout his time in the galaxy war, destruction, alien species both terrifying and majestic, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. His mind raced, but he kept his hands steady, not wanting to frighten her more than she already was. She was a small thing, fragile, her large eyes filled with fear. He could see the subtle trembling of her delicate form, the way she flinched at the smallest movement. It was as though she were expecting him to strike, to harm her in some way, but all he wanted was to help. The tiny alien girl's skin was a pale, almost translucent shade of blue, speckled with faint patterns that seemed to shift like the stars in the night sky. Her limbs were slender, her posture hunched as though she were preparing to flee at any moment. She looked so fragile compared to the other creatures he had met in his time, her frailty only accentuating the vulnerability she felt. Elias felt a pang of sympathy for her. You don't have to be afraid, Elias said, his voice soft but firm, trying to convey that he wasn't a threat. The alien girl took a small step back, eyes wide and wary, as if preparing to bolt at the slightest provocation. The atmosphere between them felt thick with tension. He had no idea how to reassure her, how to bridge the immense gap between them. He had never known anything about her species or her culture. All he knew was that she was alone, and from the looks of her scarred, exhausted, and fearful, something terrible had happened to her. Her gaze shifted quickly, darting back and forth between him and the distance behind her. She was constantly calculating, always on alert, as if she expected something to jump out at her at any moment. A human who wasn't trying to capture her, or enslave her, or do something sinister. That was a rarity. Elias knew she probably couldn't fathom someone being kind, someone not motivated by profit or power. She had likely seen her world burn, been abandoned by her people, and left to survive on her own. Elias, however, had no idea why she was alone or how she ended up on this planet. Her spacecraft had crashed, and there had been no signs of any survivors from the wreckage. No bodies, no blood, only the alien girl, barely conscious, with nothing but the torn remains of her clothing and the wreckage of her ship. "What's your name?" Elias asked softly, kneeling down to make himself less intimidating, though every instinct told him to keep standing in case something else appeared. The alien girl's eyes flickered, clearly unsure whether she should speak or stay silent. Her small form shook again, her body language closing in on itself, as though preparing for some unseen strike. Elias's heart ached seeing her so small, so afraid. I don't have a name," she replied quietly after a long pause, her voice soft and tentative. Her words hit him with a deeper understanding. She had no name. She was, in a way, forgotten. It was like her identity had been stripped from her, the remnants of her civilization crumbling, and she was now just an orphan untethered from any history, from any culture. Elias could see in her eyes that the concept of belonging was foreign to her, almost as if she believed her existence didn't matter. But it did. It mattered to him, and it mattered to the universe. "Everyone has a name," Elias said, his voice carrying a note of warmth, trying to give her something to hold on to. "I'm Elias." The alien girl tilted her head slightly, almost in confusion, then lowered her gaze again, her small hands clutched in front of her. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something flicker, a hesitation, a flicker of hope, and just a hint of curiosity. "Elias," she repeated softly, as if the word was a taste on her tongue, unfamiliar but somehow grounding. "Yes," Elias said with a gentle smile, though she didn't return it. It wasn't that she didn't want to. Elias could see that much, but she had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe that he wouldn't harm her as every other human had. "I won't hurt you. I promise. You're safe here." The alien girl stared at him, her eyes still wide with uncertainty. She seemed to take a few cautious steps forward, not out of trust, but out of sheer curiosity. She was caught between fear and the impossible thought that she might have found someone who wasn't going to harm her. It was a fragile, fleeting moment, and Elias felt his heart ache. Elias extended a hand toward her, slowly, letting her see his movements, giving her time to react, to run if she needed to. She didn't. Instead, she looked at the hand, then back at his face, reading him for any signs of treachery, as though he might suddenly lash out. But Elias didn't move. He kept his hand open, waiting. Finally, with great hesitation, she reached forward. Her fingers brushed his, light and tentative, as though she was testing the waters, as though she were certain that the moment she touched him, she would be harmed. But nothing happened. Elias's palm remained open, steady. Her small hands trembled as she placed them fully in his, and in that heartbeat, everything changed. Her pulse steadied. She was no longer looking at him as if he were a monster. She looked at him as though just for a moment he was someone she could trust. It wasn't much. It wasn't a bond forged in years of friendship, but it was a connection. "I'm not going to hurt you," Elias repeated softly, his voice full of kindness. "I just want to help." The alien girl looked at him, and for the first time, something in her expression softened. Perhaps it was the sincerity in his voice or the way his gaze remained kind, unyielding. Perhaps it was the exhaustion she'd been carrying with her for so long, her people lost, her world destroyed, her faith in everything shattered. Maybe she just needed to hear those words. She let out a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes closing for a moment, as if she was releasing the weight of an immense burden. "Help," she whispered, as if the word was foreign to her, as if she'd forgotten what it meant to be helped, what it meant to be cared for. Elias nodded slowly. "Yes, help. You're not alone anymore." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air was heavy, filled with the weight of her fear and his determination to make things right. They were from different worlds, different species, and yet, in this one quiet, fragile moment, They were united by something that transcended their differences. Trust, the promise of safety. A bond formed not by force or fate, but by the shared understanding that they were both lost and needed each other. Chapter 2. The Journey Ahead. As Elias and the tiny alien girl sat in the shelter, the storm outside continued to rage, a never-ending roar of wind and rain that seemed to encapsulate the feeling of desolation that had overtaken them both. The night was thick with the sounds of nature, but it wasn't the forest or the storm that weighed heavily on Elias. It was the small, trembling figure beside him. He had promised her safety, but he hadn't quite figured out how he would protect her in the long term. They were both stranded on a hostile world, one where danger could lurk behind every corner, and he was still piecing together what had happened to the girl before her ship crashed. "What's your name?" Elias asked again, hoping the second time might invite a more relaxed response. He knew it was a simple question, but it held weight. Names, after all, were more than just sounds. They were identities, histories, and memories. He wanted to give her the chance to reclaim hers, to restore some part of herself that had been taken away when her world had been destroyed. The alien girl looked up at him through those wide eyes, her long, dark lashes damp from the rain that had soaked through her thin clothes. She still seemed hesitant, unsure, and even though Elias had offered her food and shelter, the tension between them lingered like an unspoken question. "My name is—" "I do not have one," she said quietly, as if the words weighed heavily on her. "I had a name before. A different one. But now, I don't remember it." She looked away from him then, her voice faltering slightly. "It was taken from me." The sadness in her voice pulled at Elias's heart, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. What could he say? She was so small, so alone, and yet the pain in her words was so big, something so deep it transcended language, transcended the physical world. This tiny alien girl had lived through horrors that Elias couldn't even fathom. She had seen her people destroyed, her home taken from her, and now she was stranded on this unknown planet, with nothing but the wreckage of her escape pod and the scraps of her memory. "It's okay," Elias said softly, trying to offer comfort. "You don't have to tell me everything. But when you're ready, if you want to dash," he stopped, not wanting to push her too far. "I'll help you, whatever you need." Her eyes flickered up to him, the softness of his tone perhaps catching her off guard. She blinked once, then twice, before nodding very slightly, as if she were trying to process his offer, and yet was still unsure if she could trust him. The flicker of hesitation in her eyes was almost imperceptible, but Elias saw it. It was the same hesitation that had plagued her since the moment they met, her fear of the unknown, of trusting again after everything had been taken from her. The sound of thunder cracked outside, and the alien girl flinched. Her body stiffened slightly at the noise, her eyes widening. It was clear that the storm, something she had no control over, triggered some sort of instinctual reaction in her. Elias could see that she wasn't just afraid of the elements. There was something else, something deeper. "I'm sorry," Elias said gently, noticing her reaction. "I didn't mean to bring up bad memories." The alien girl shook her head slowly, her gaze distant. "The storm, it's not just the noise. It reminds me of the battle, the war, the day everything changed." Her voice trailed off, and Elias could feel her retreating into herself again. "Can I help?" Elias asked, his voice low, offering what little comfort he could. "If you want, I'll keep you safe from the storm. You can stay here as long as you need." She looked at him then, eyes still filled with that lingering doubt, but for the first time since they'd met, Elias saw a tiny spark of something else in her gaze. It was a glimmer of trust, faint but real. And for a moment, Elias allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to break through the walls she had built around herself. The storm raged outside, but the alien girl stayed close to Elias, huddling by the small fire they had built for warmth. He didn't know how long they would remain on this strange planet, how long they would both have to hide from whatever forces might be hunting her, but he knew one thing: they would face it together. He would help her, and she would help him, even if she didn't yet know it. Chapter 3. The Heartbeat of the Unknown. The days that followed were a blur of quiet conversations, small moments of bonding, and the slow realization that neither Elias nor the alien girl could continue hiding forever. The planet they were on was far from a hospitable home. It was a place of harsh environments and relentless weather, with sparse resources that seemed barely enough to sustain them. Yet, in a way, that isolation brought them closer. Elias had given her a name, and though she had initially resisted, it wasn't long before she began to accept it. She had introduced herself as Lyra. Her people had a different naming convention, but for now, Elias felt it was a fitting name for her. She was small, fragile, and yet her resilience was undeniable. She had lived through something unimaginable, and though her body was frail, Elias could feel the strength in her spirit. Lyra wasn't the type to open up quickly. She still kept her distance, still clung to her past, but Elias could see the slow shifts in her demeanor. When the storms would pass, and they ventured into the rocky hills to gather what little resources the planet offered, she would smile faintly, a smile so fleeting it was almost a ghost. But it was a smile nonetheless. One morning, as they trudged through the mud-covered paths, Elias noticed something different in Lyra's eyes. A small glimmer of something beyond survival, something he hadn't seen in her before. "Do you remember where you're from?" Elias asked as they moved together, navigating the rugged terrain. His voice was gentle, as always, but the question weighed on him. He wanted to know more about her home, about the culture she had come from. In all their time together, she hadn't told him much about her past, just fragments, little bits of information that were as scattered as the wreckage that had brought her here. Lyra hesitated, her small frame stiffening as the question sunk in. But this time, her hesitation was different. It wasn't fear. It wasn't avoidance. There was a soft sadness in her eyes, something Elias hadn't seen before. "I remember." She began slowly, her voice quiet, almost to herself. "I remember the fields, the stars above us. We lived under the stars, Elias. Our people, my people, were stargazers. We lived in harmony with the universe, always looking up, always learning. But we were not prepared for the war. We were not prepared for what came." Elias stopped walking, his attention fully on her now. He had never imagined the stories Lyra might have, the history of her people that was now lost to the galaxy. He had assumed her species was a warrior race, strong, battle-hardened, but now he realized the war she had been thrust into wasn't part of their culture. They were peaceful, explorers of the stars, before everything changed. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she continued, her voice trembling. "We never asked for war. We didn't ask for any of this. But it found us." Elias took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling in. It wasn't just survival. She wasn't just running from danger. She was running from the remnants of her world, her entire culture destroyed. "I'm sorry," Elias said, his voice rough, thick with emotion. "I can't imagine what you've been through." Lyra turned her face away from him, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You don't have to. You don't need to understand. I need to find my people. I need to know if anyone else survived." Elias knew that feeling of loss, of searching for something that was lost to time, to war, to tragedy. He had lost his own family in the endless chaos of the galaxy, and though he hadn't spoken of it, he could feel the weight of that shared experience with Lyra. He knew what it was like to survive when others hadn't. "We'll find them, Lyra," he said quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I promise." In that moment, Elias knew their journey was far from over. They had only just begun to fight for survival in this strange, hostile world. But now, they had something more than survival. They had each other. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to heal the wounds of the past together. For the next several days, the quiet tension between Elias and Lyra began to shift. There was still an air of caution between them, a recognition of the fragile trust that had been built between them over time. But it was different now. There was something more than just survival in their partnership, something that held them together as they faced the uncertainty of their situation. For the first time since she had crash-landed on this alien planet, Lyra felt like she was not entirely alone. She had someone by her side who was willing to help, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Elias had always been a man of action, quick to assess a situation and make decisions. But as he worked alongside Lyra, gathering food, fixing makeshift shelters, and planning their next steps, he found that their bond grew beyond just the physical. They began to learn more about each other, not just their immediate needs, but their fears, their histories, and the things they had left behind. Each shared moment, whether it was a silent glance over a meal or a quiet conversation by the fire, built a sense of understanding that neither of them had expected to find. One evening, after they had gathered enough supplies to last a few more days, Lyra sat on a flat rock beside Elias, staring at the horizon. The storm had cleared, and the sky stretched out before them, a canvas of deep blue fading to purple as the sun set. She had been quiet for a while, lost in thought, and Elias could sense that she was still grappling with the enormity of her situation. "I never wanted to fight," Lyra said suddenly, her voice low but clear. "I was a healer, a caretaker. We were supposed to bring balance to our world, to maintain peace. We were explorers, Elias. We lived with the stars, not for them." Elias nodded, understanding the pain in her voice. He had heard about the ill-recalled people in ancient species with deep knowledge of the cosmos, who had devoted their existence to exploration, science, and healing. They were peaceful, as Lyra had described, and yet they had been destroyed in an instant, caught in the crossfire of a war they never wanted to fight. It reminded him of how war and conquest could consume everything in its path, regardless of the initial intentions of those involved. "I'm sorry," Elias said softly, his voice sincere. "You didn't deserve any of this." Lyra didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, watching the sunset as though searching for something, an answer, perhaps, or a way to piece together the fractured parts of her identity. Finally, she spoke again, her tone quieter, more introspective. "There's so much I don't understand," she murmured. "I don't understand how everything changed so fast. One moment, we were exploring the stars, and the next, everything was gone." Elias leaned back slightly, crossing his arms as he watched her. "Sometimes it's hard to make sense of it. When war comes, it doesn't ask permission. It just happens. You just try to survive it, one day at a time." Lyra's eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment, he thought she might respond, but she remained silent. The weight of what she had lost seemed to hang in the air between them. Elias could see it in her eyes, the deep sadness, the unspoken grief that she carried with her. He didn't know what to say to make it better, and part of him knew that nothing he could say would change the past. But he also knew that they still had each other, for now. And that had to count for something. Lyra had turned to face him, her expression serious. "Elias," she began, her voice steady now. "Do you think it's possible to start over? To rebuild something from all this destruction?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. The question hung in the air, pulling at something deep within him. The thought of rebuilding after everything he had lost, everything she had lost, it seemed impossible, but the fact that she was asking meant something. "I don't know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But maybe, together, we can find a way." Lyra nodded, her face softening. There was a flicker of hope in her eyes now, a spark that hadn't been there before. Elias couldn't promise her that they would find everything she had lost, but he could promise that he would be there for her, as long as she needed him. Chapter 4, The Final Journey. The days turned into weeks, and Elias and Lyra adapted to life on the alien planet. Their shelter was modest, nothing more than a sturdy hut made from the native materials of the planet, and their food was scarce, but enough to get by. Still, there were small moments of peace between them, moments that allowed them to reflect on what had brought them to this place and what lay ahead. Despite the constant danger of being discovered, the looming threat of the Zidarians, Elias had begun to notice something he hadn't expected: hope. A flicker, no matter how small, that had been ignited by their unlikely bond. One morning, as they were preparing to gather supplies again, Lyra turned to him, her small frame standing tall despite the weariness that had settled in her bones. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice firm. "We need to leave this planet. There's nothing for us here." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Leave? Where would we go?" Lyra's eyes glinted with resolve. "We'll find a way to make it off this planet. You've shown me that not all humans are the same. There's kindness in you. Maybe, just maybe, there's still something out there for us." Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. She was right, there was no point in staying hidden, waiting for death or capture. They had to move forward, even if they didn't know exactly where the future would take them. Together, they could face whatever came next. "We'll find a way," Elias agreed, his voice steady with newfound determination. "We'll fix that ship, or find another way to get us to safety." The days ahead weren't easy. They scoured the wreckage of the ship that had brought Lyra to this planet, trying to salvage any parts that might help them get off the ground. They worked tirelessly, and Lyra's skills with technology skills that came from her past life proved invaluable. She taught Elias what she knew about alien engineering, showing him how to repurpose parts and adapt technology in ways he never would have imagined. It wasn't long before they had enough to construct a makeshift transmitter and a rudimentary engine. Their escape plan was not without its flaws, but it was all they had. And one evening, as they looked out at the horizon, the ship, a battered, reassembled version of Lyra's escape pod, stood ready. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the ship she had once called home, but it was something more important. It was a symbol of their survival, a symbol of what they had built together. "Are you ready?" Elias asked, his voice filled with quiet anticipation. Lyra stood beside him, looking out at the vast expanse of space ahead of them. "I think I am," she replied softly, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. And in that moment, Elias realized that it didn't matter where they went. What mattered was that they had each other, that they had found a way to move forward together. Whatever the galaxy had in store for them, they would face it together. With a final glance at the planet they had both been forced to call home for so long, they climbed into the ship, and the engines roared to life. The journey ahead was uncertain, but the heartbeat of hope, small and fragile, yet powerful, was their guide. And as they flew into the unknown, Elias and Lyra knew one thing for sure. Together, they could face anything.